Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, blighters, fighters and sonnet writers, welcome along to the Joe Spiver YouTube channel where we discuss books and little else, and welcome back to our inaugural read-along on the Joe Spiver YouTube channel. We are going through the life, times, works, a multifaceted nature, exploits, arduous excursions, philanderous episodes of George Gordon, 6th Lord Byron of Newstead Abbey, also known more colloquially as Byron, Lord Byron. Yes, just a quick word, I hope I'm not too far away as to be blurred, and I hope I'm not too close to the camera as to seem in any way invasive. I, of course, have just purchased, not myself, but I have been very handily, unfortunately, given a Canon EOS 2000D 1080p 30 frame per second camera, and cannot work it, or at least utilise it to its most propitious extent for the life of me. I feel like a 19th century Russian serf has been given a 21st century refrigerator. I know that it's a great piece of technology, and I know that it's going to help me in innumerable ways, but I can't for the life of me actualise those positives. But anyway, hopefully this is all going across okay. Yes, so we looked at Byron's vituperative and just ceaselessly difficult life when he was famous in metropolitan London in the era sort of, I think it was 1812 to about 1816, and then we begin this section called Celebrity in Exile, by far the longest section in Fiona McCarthy's very, very good biography. Yeah, it's about, I think it's about 250 pages, stretching right from the moment he leaves the English shores for the final time to his untimely and completely avoidable death in Missolonghi. So, what ground have we got to cover? I've got plenty of things highlighted, plenty of things underlined to share with you guys. So I'm going to try and make the run through a little bit more digestible and a little bit more concise. So he goes with his usual retinue. He goes via Ostend and Bruges, I think it is. Any of you guys on the north coast of England like myself who frequent P&O ferries will know Bruges and Ostend all too well. I'm still not allowed in that country for reasons that will be revealed possibly when I'm a little more famous later on. But yes, he goes to Ostend and Bruges. He is... He goes right across to Italy and reconvenes with the Shelleys, with Percy and Mary Shelley, and they have that very famous evening where they concoct they each concoct a Halloween, a harrowing, a scary story, which in a flight of fancy from Mary Shelley became Frankenstein, and I can't remember what Byron got from that. I think it was perhaps the starts of Don Juan, I can't remember. But anyway, so Shelley and Byron cut very, very odd figures, as you well might imagine. You've got this, not an adventurous, but sort of Panglossian, quite safe and not politically but socially conservative, quite timid Percy Shelley, sailing and swanning about on a boat with the lugubrious and salacious, scandalous Lord Byron, who thinks he's a little bit cool for Shelley's company. I think you sense very much that Shelley's always the one that's sort of tapping his feet and twiddling his thumbs and waiting for Byron to get everything in order before they leave the chateau or the palazzo that particular day. Within their company is a lady called Claire Claremont, who will bear Byron one of his two at least announced or recognised children, who will be called Allegra, whom he soon shuffles off to a detestable Calvinistic convent, pretty much a self-abnegatory camp of pseudo-religious zealots who, I think, break her, essentially. But that's a story for another day. And yes, so I've got a few sections early on that I wanted to pick out that show the recognisability of Byron and him with Shelley. So Byron's was not an incognito exile. By the time he left England, his self-conscious, softly disdainful face was instantly recognisable. Of the 40 or so portraits of Byron still extant, the majority were made during his years of fame in London, reproduced in engravings, widely distributed in popular social and fashion magazines. Before he departed, Byron's aristocratic features had been imprinted in the minds and the imaginations of the public. His questionable private life had much increased his fame. And it comes rather, I don't know whether it's ironically, but just funnily, that his preeminence and his notoriety, i.e. fame for negative reasons, is worsened by the fact that he's not there and isn't there to be able to account for some of his daring poetry that he writes. So this is talking about Percy Shelley and Byron. Meeting Shelley at this juncture was more important to Byron than he ever admitted. Sir Timothy, Shelley's father, was a baronet and wealthy Sussex landowner. Both poets came from a similarly privileged background, but Shelley was by far the more iconoclastic. The younger man's purity of attitude, his radical idealism, sustained a solemn belief in the intrinsic value of poetry and in Byron's responsibility to himself and to others of one of poetry's supreme practitioners. Affectionately, Byron was to name Shelley Shillot after the imagined child in the womb of the Methodist prophet Joanna Southcott, yada yada yada, though Byron considered Shelley to farouche, which I've underlined, farouche, whose meaning I'm still yet to discern, and otherworldly to be listed among his intimates, he appreciated his directness, seeing Shelley as a genuinely good man. To some degree at least, it was Shelley's strong belief in him that helped to restore his shattered confidence. There we have Fiona McCarthy earning her keep as a biographer in giving us some vital insights into how it was that Percy Shelley sort of reignited the Baron. Next up, he goes across to I think it's Geneva, a bit of the Swiss Alps with Hobhouse, who becomes estranged from Byron. Then he goes across to Ravenna, the proper Italian years and days. He goes to Ravenna, he goes to Pisa. And there he meets Teresa, I'm going to go with Giucioli. Any of you Italian speakers will no doubt castigate me for such butchering of your native tongue, but I think it's Teresa Giucioli who forms with Byron a really curious menage a trois with, all the French speakers will now be castigating me, with Alessandro Giucioli, who is Byron's social and political, sort of personal and societal match. He's just as imposing, just as attractive, and just as appealing to the fair sex. And it's really weird that it's clear. Obviously, the reason Byron left was because of the more relaxed rules around extramarital affairs and infidelity, and it's very clear that it was by the concessionary Italian standards of the time, it was seen as perhaps even helpful and beneficial, or at least something that you could easily overlook and mitigate against, was the wandering off of a wife with a husband for an sort of personal and romantic benefit. And so he moves into the Palace Giucioli with Teresa and Alessandro, and as I say, they form a curious sort of menage a trois. Then the sale of Newstead Abbey. At long last, goodness knows who his lawyers and executors were, but that has taken the best part of a decade to sell off due to the sale of Newstead for I think about £92,000. He has, for the first time in ages and ages and ages, actual liquidity. He's not just living on credit, and he has some financial freedom. He moves into the Palazzo Lanfranchi in Pisa, right across the bay from Shelley, and just continues to avoid British expatriates and wants to really get in and go native with the indigene, as it were. He remarks on very many occasions how it is that it's been 6 and 8 months at a time between him speaking English. He obviously writes his poetry in English, but he's speaking Italian from dawn to dusk, I think. This is where he publishes his most scandalous poetry as well. You've got Cain and Don Juan and the third canto of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which, because Shelley is, again, by McCarthy here, said to be forcing bits of Wordsworth on him, apparently becomes a little bit more gloopy and a bit more naturalistic. Now, I haven't actually read Byron's poetry for quite a bit, actually. Obviously, I read my favourites now and then, but I haven't done a full reread of the oeuvre for some time, so we're going to have to go through that again when indeed we do look at the works. But apparently, it becomes a bit more gloopy, a little bit more spiritual, a little bit more Rivendell-esque, a little bit more... just a bit more fanciful, I think. But he starts fighting with his publisher John Murray back in London because he rightfully estimates that Mr. Murray is underpaying Byron for all of his stuff. Obviously, our thoughts have to go out to Mr. Murray because he is shouldering an awful lot of the burden of some of Byron's invectives and some of his charges against the aristocracy, against the monarchy, against priggish living, and Murray essentially comes to the conclusion that Byron is a little bit too hot to handle. And again, which is all very understandable, Byron thinks that he's being underpaid for his manuscripts, which is true as well. So it's just, the inevitable conclusion of two people caught up in a hot societal furore who, just will not be able to get on for very much longer. Then, well, you can already see throughout much of his life, Byron is, for very obvious reasons, an empathiser and sympathiser with the subjugated and the downtrodden and the manipulated and the oppressed, and the ostracised and those who are seen to be outsiders. Since the collapse of the Napoleonic Empire, as it were, Italy is pretty much under the or is in the yoke of of an Austrian regime, Byron sympathises, heaven forbid, with some of the Italian natives, and that's that similar sentiment for iconoclasm and for a bit of sort of wistful idealistic irreverence, and for for the many, not the few, as Mr. Corbyn would have said it, spreads across to his advocating for Greek independence against the regime of the Turks. And at that time, with John Hobhouse as a storied member, the London Greek Committee, what a title, contact him and offer him support and quite a lot of money to be essentially the issuer of a clarion call, the face of the campaign trail, and somebody with deep pockets to support the fight for Greek independence against the Turks in Cephalonia and Missolonghi, which is where Byron eventually heads off to. He gets there, and Fletcher goes with him, and he's got a little page called Lucas, who he makes unrequited sexual advances towards. In Cephalonia and Missolonghi, he soon comes to the inevitable conclusion that this is pretty much a lost cause. It's the first time where he becomes a little bit more conscientious and straight-laced and has a Petersonian purpose. He gets up every morning and makes his bed and does a daily routine and presumably reads Marcus Aurelius and wants to have women barefoot in the kitchen, but at least he's driven. And this is the first time where you don't get him chin stroking and you don't get any kind of laxity with him. He's really purposeful and dutiful and sees it as his moral obligation to help these poor suckers out, essentially. It's a little bit of a lost cause because there is infighting with I'm going to forget then, it's like the Soriotes or something like that, the Soriote tribe, or at least a collection of soldiers, but he gives an awful lot of money. He gets because he's a famous poet and a famous face throughout Europe through the engravings and the portraiture. He is a famous face throughout Europe, and so he gets not a champion's return, but a champion's welcome on the shores of Cephalonia and Missolonghi. But then he becomes really ruinously ill. It has been concluded by modern doctors that it's I think it's a tick-infected malaria or something. He has two monoglottal, that's a bit of spit on the camera, he has two monoglottal doctors who cannot consort to save their lives because neither of them speak the other person's tongue. There is an incident of bloodletting which goes terribly. Essentially what you did was, when you were getting shivers and bouts of delirium and you were in an altogether uncomfortable state, I think would be an understatement, but nonetheless, when you did that, the contemporary doctors popped leeches onto your forehead, and you were bits of blood were drawn from you, and they actually popped one of the leeches into one of his arteries, and so he bleeds for ages and ages and ages, which is completely avoidable. And I think contemporary doctors modern doctors have concluded that he lost, I think, about 2.5 litres of blood. But anyway, I'm going to get into. So he dies an untimely death in April of 1824, after shuddering and just not listening to medical advice and being too, wrong-headed and hard-headed and obstinate in his wanting to swim ponds and, sort of gallivant about in the worst of weathers on his horse, and again, it comes back to a selfishness and a disregard for the word of others. For such an empathetic and profound poet, the guy was... You really do discern from these pages in particular that he was not somebody to be reasoned with, and was an orotund and often furious person given to flights of anger and resentment. So yes, let's get into some of the other sections that I've pulled out. What have we got? Oh, so this is when Don Juan is published, and it is Don Juan, folks. It's not Don Juan. It is Don Juan, because the rhyming schemes in the opening stanzas would render it impossible to read if you pronounced it Don Juan. It wouldn't rhyme, so it is Don Juan. The problems in Don Juan that most exercised his friends were, first and foremost, Byron's portrait of Juan's mother, the blue-stocking Donna Inés, all too easily recognisable as Lady Byron in her prim dimity dresses, dimity rhyming very comically to sublimity, as Tom Moore pointed out. The conclusion of one stanza, "I hate a dumpy woman," seemed particularly cruel. They were concerned about Byron's attacks on religion and his abuse of contemporary writers. The poem was dedicated to the poet laureate Robert Southey, Byron's bête noire, savagely attacking his political affiliations. To add insult to injury, Byron nicknamed Southey Dry Bob in a lewd slang reference to copulation without emission. So that's, yeah, it's very clear that London doesn't like him anymore. And next we've got the weird, not weird, but I think actually quite predictable proficiency of Byron, the predictable theatrical proficiency of Byron. He seems to be a very good actor indeed. This is Thomas Medwin talking about him playing Iago in a cancelled production of Shakespeare's Othello. They got as far as the first run-through, which persuaded Thomas Medwin that Byron could have been one of the world's great actors. His voice had a flexibility, a variety in its tones, a power and pathos beyond any I've ever heard, and his countenance was capable of expressing the tenderest as well as the strongest emotions. I shall never forget his reading Iago's part in the handkerchief scene. It was said that Byron even looked like Iago, but Teresa came jealous of the prospective Desdemona, and the performance was vetoed. So Byron was a good performer as well, and for somebody who was duplicitous and was very often putting on an act at dinner parties when he was feeling sad and solemn, when he had to be more uppity and sort of more frivolous and more felicitous, this is very understandable. Next we've got the publication of Cain. It is an irresistible scene. Byron, the renowned poet of ungodliness, denounced for Cain from pulpits throughout England, locked in gentle, bantering argument with an evangelical preacher on a Sunday afternoon in Cephalonia. Rather to Kennedy's relief, since he distracted the other participants, Lord Byron was not present at any further readings at Muir's house, but their discussions continued in private. What Kennedy discerned, and Byron appreciated, was that although by no means a conventional believer, Byron came closer to Christianity than his detractors would have expected. So you've got a slightly religious man, heaven forbid, coming out of the pages here. And whenever she does give herself elbow room, Fiona McCarthy, when she sifts through the Malaise and really gets into the weeds and gets into the biographical gristle, she justifies her conclusions really rather well. So what's this we're talking about? Oh, this is talking about his bravery. This is perhaps the real heroism of Byron's intervention in the Greek War. He, whose irritability was so intense, had to cope with the day-to-day friction of the varied military factions in Missolonghi, the constant sound of gunfire in the street. The writer, disgusted by the brutal facts of war, now had to endure the massacres and horrors of a primitive and savage confrontation in which prisoners were slaughtered without compunction. Byron's fears for Lucas, which is his young, beautiful Greek page, were well based. His days of self-indulgent pleasure were over. He wrote to Teresa ruefully, "Of course you may suppose that a country like this is not exactly the place to pass the carnival in." What else have we got here? So we've got factotums, and then we've got just bits and bobs about his difficulty in organising, Greek independence. But I want to know what if heaven forbid you're still clutching to your mantelpieces and windowsills and are still in this for the long haul and the ride, if you've managed to get through the pages to about 480 at the end of Celebrity in Exile, what on earth are you thinking of Byron? Obviously we have the proof of his letters and journals and his poetry, but I suppose the point of a biography is to get at the man. And I've already issued out the bruised and battered, hackneyed cliches of him being, capricious, and him being given to flights of fancy, and him not being altogether very conscientious or having much staying power. But it just seems, right at the end anyway, when he dies at the age of 36, I suppose that's the prototypically romantic thing to do. I'm holding a painting brush now, hopefully I'm more eloquent with this in my hand. Yeah, it seems to be prototypically romantic for dying at the age of 36, but it just seems a senseless and injudicious waste of human life for him to have passed at 36. Imagine, folks, if he'd have lived another 36 years and had been a little bit more healthy and was able to, quash and quell any of the mentally ruinous and suicidal ideation that so beset him throughout his life. Imagine if he could have just had a decent doctor and he could have returned to England and had a decent cause and not have been as hedonistic. How richer and more fecund would the poetical corpus and canon be if we had, you know, twice the amount of Byronic poetry that is currently on the market. And of course then you've got I think what McCarthy's going to go into next, obviously got to advertise the fact that you've got to read the end, folks. You must. This is the Byron cult between pages 525 right up to 575, so it's only 50 pages, so you should be able to scatter through that by the end of the week. We've got the burning of the biography and the self-contrived biography and the one that he himself curated. And yeah, we need to discuss that as well. So yeah, we've got the cult coming next and how the Byronic myth and magic has proliferated throughout the years. But I'm probably going to run out of time on this camera, folks. So I'm going to thank you for listening to me jabber on for in excess of 20 minutes once more. And yes, see you in the next video, folks. And thank you ever so much for watching BookTube. And goodbye.